So we're very happy to have you here. John, thank you much for coming. John is a senior consultant at Willis Towers Watson and has an expertise in many different things. Today he's going to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder within Georgia and nationally. So John, I'll let you take it away.
Great. Thank you, Dan. And thanks to everyone for taking time out this afternoon to join the call. I really do appreciate, and it's such a privilege to have an opportunity to speak to folks on these types of issues, which are truly emerging, evolving issues. And post-traumatic stress disorder is a very fast-moving, quickly expanding issue nationally and not surprisingly globally too, right? So just a little bit of background, and thank you for the kind words. So I am a senior consultant with Willis Towers Watson, and I work with LGRMS as well as with ACCG and GMA. As a side note, I was part of the original team that created the Georgia Firefighter Cancer Benefit Program. And the reason I mention that is, one, is Georgia was the first state in the nation to adopt an alternative program, but like any good Georgian, you know, your example is followed by others nationally. So there are a lot of other states that are putting similar programs in place as we speak. Many of them are sister states in the Southeast that have watched the Georgia program and have seen its great value and have moved forward. What is interesting with the Georgia program, if you think about firefighter cancer, that is an issue, a risk issue specific to this occupational issue regarding the filing of cancer claims within the workers' comp system. And the issue that surrounds it is the fact that proving causality, in other words, the occupation of the firefighter caused the cancer, tends to be problematic. What is interesting, the reason I mention that is, in many ways, PTSD is it's a very similar concept. So as we talk about it today, I want to provide you a little bit of backdrop as to what the issue looks like nationally, and talk a little bit about we'll look at some statistics, some emerging trends, and then we'll talk a little bit about toward the second part of the discussion will be more along the lines of preventative steps that we can take to manage the risk. If you think about the goal of this discussion today is to some extent is to better understand the issue, but certainly to begin to discuss what are certain consistent steps, risk management steps to be taken, whether you are a large municipality or a small county, right? So the idea would be to we'll provide some basic principles or structures around creating a program at the local level that speaks to and addresses prevention and assistance as opposed to diagnosis and treatment. I have this great privilege of working with two psychologists. One is actually a psychiatrist, so don't tell him I said that. But a psychiatrist and a psychologist who are assisting in the development of some of these programs for different states that are interested in looking at them. And in so many ways, I learned so much from speaking with professionals about the treatment. But it would not surprise you to know that there's far more emphasis on prevention. Even within the medical community, in the treatment community, their focus in many ways is on prevention. In other words, what steps may be taken to assist a first responder who is suffering from some of the symptoms but has not yet been diagnosed specifically with PTSD. And to understand PTSD, and we'll talk about it in a second, is to know that in so many ways it is unlike cancer, which is a diagnosis and then a treatment pattern. A first responder could suffer from PTSD for many, many years, or at least the symptoms of it, before ever seeking out treatment, which is one of the real primary issues that with regards to risk management and prevention is that this, and it's a central issue too, is this issue of stigma, where a first responder simply feels either embarrassed or uncomfortable or simply unwilling to seek help for that type of condition. So as we go through this, I'm going to remind you in a few different ways of some of these best, and think of them as best practices, and I'll explain some of the sources of these practices and where I've seen them in other locations. But I think with that said, let's move forward. So we're first going to talk about the PTSD as a condition, and what it's essentially, how large is this issue, or how compelling is this issue? And the reason why I think it's important to start there is that when you think about PTSD, in many ways, the reason it's emerging and evolving so rapidly isn't so much about treatment. It isn't really so much about new advances in counseling. All of that is true. But what you see is, and if you look at this first slide, you can see these emerging trends where it's a very high percentage of first responders who have been diagnosed with clinical depression or PTSD. And when you speak to the first responders, they'll remind you that this issue is actually bigger than PTSD. It really is around behavioral health. So that when we talk about prevention, we're really talking about efforts that would impact behavioral health generally, right? So it's not just PTSD. It's actually broader than that. But as we get to it, I'll remind you. So look, let's talk about these statistics. So these are first responder statistics, right? Police, fire, EMT. You see PTSD in a lot of different spots. That is oftentimes surprising with 9/11 or 911 operators. It wouldn't surprise you. There's a very high level of PTSD for folks working in correctional facilities and prisons. Very high level of PTSD or incidents in emergency rooms. So if you're an emergency room physician or a nurse and you're continually exposed to very traumatic events, it stands to reason that you are, at risk for developing PTSD over time. And so the reason I mention that is that you think about how it's expanding. In many ways, those occupations don't necessarily immediately come to mind as PTSD types of situations. In other words, if you think of PTSD, which requires, in many ways, is defined sort of as a exposure to a traumatic event, which alters the brain composition. And in many ways, when you speak to different authorities on PTSD, a lot of them will remind you it's not post-traumatic stress disorder. That's the common terminology. They describe it as post-traumatic stress injury. So the traumatic event created an injury, right? Caused an injury to the mind, to the brain, that requires some type of treatment to essentially mend it. So again, you can see, that, and it's a guess, 20 to 37% of first responders likely to be diagnosed specifically with PTSD. The reason I say that's a guess, there's a fair number of white papers out across the nation that talk about what those first responder rates, and they vary a little bit based on whether it's police or fire too. Police tends to, strangely, fire tends to have a slightly higher incidence than police. EMT falls about in the middle. The balance of them are pretty much the same. And then finally, you'll see 24 states now permit the use of medical marijuana for PTSD. That is a very recent trend, but it's an effort to draw new types of therapies to the treatment of PTSD. And I'll talk a little bit when it's appropriate about the VA and their approaches to the treatment of PTSD, which is, most of you know that the VA is struggling and has struggled for many years to manage the volume of claims, given that we have been in combat now for many years overseas. So the VA struggles to treat a lot of veterans who, and many of them, nearly 30% of them, work as a first responder. So you draw that thread through looking or reviewing the VA and its steps that it has taken to manage the volume gives us some good signposts that we'll talk about in prevention. And again, the debt of 9/11 and its aftermath really do cause, I wouldn't say cause, but draws in considerable discussion. When you think of politicians, you think of lobbyists, whether it's at the federal level or the state level, there's still this, true agreement that first responders have earned protection for their health under the law in whatever facet it may be, whether it's legislation or programs at the local level. And you don't necessarily need a law to do that. It's just maybe it's a program that could accomplish the same. You don't necessarily need a politician to tell you what to do, right? I think we know what to do. And finally, I mentioned workers' compensation just because a lot of folks believe that workers' comp program is really the place for these claims to be dealt with. And the response is, and I mentioned this earlier, is that in many ways that's, if you think of workers' comp, that is a resource after following a diagnosis, more likely than not. So in some ways, and this is how I look at it, is that our efforts are better spent in prevention as opposed to workers' comp or diagnosis, that sort of thing. The risk issue, right? The risk issue, the risk management issue, ultimately flows back to workers' compensation when a first responder is diagnosed, and whether it's compensable under the comp plans or the comp rules. But still, the question you have, and this is the last line at the bottom, you'll see is that the cost of PTSD as a risk is virtually unknown. So I spent a lot of time with a number of states drafting legislation. I just returned from Connecticut last week and assisted that state in the creation of a type of preventative program that's unique nationally. But it's funny when you think of it, it's what stops a lot of folks in their tracks is the fact that estimating the cost of PTSD is extremely hard. People, there are actuaries, that group of very smart people are making headway and engaging the cost of it to a municipality or to a county. But still, there's a lot that remains in terms of just exactly what that cost is. Part of that uncertainty is that the breadth, in other words, the volume of claims is very hard to predict. Unlike firefighter cancer, where the incidence of cancer within the fire service is relatively easy to predict, or at least the actuaries are more comfortable estimating it. With PTSD, if for the example that we started with, if we know that there are first responders who are suffering from PTSD symptoms but have yet to be diagnosed and are not seeking treatment, the uncertainty of those examples really calls into question and consideration the preventative side of this. And I don't mean to harp on prevention, but our best work in the state of Georgia will be the crafting of consistent preventative programs. There's always resources once diagnosed with a behavioral health condition, but in so many ways, it's our best work is to craft a structure that assists a first responder who is suffering from, but who is yet to be diagnosed, to assist that first responder in recovery. So, with that said, so here are some national statistics that I draw from PTSD United, which is a great organization, by the way. And what this gives you is a slightly broader understanding of how PTSD impacts people generally, right? So remember, there's a traumatic event that tends to trigger it. It isn't, don't lose sight of, unlike other conditions that may be organic and somehow affect a person's health over time, PTSD has a traumatic, there's trauma involved. There's a traumatic event. It may not be one event, and they call that aggregative trauma. In other words, you could be a firefighter for 25 years and exposed to, and they all have been, by the way, all exposed to traumatic events for 25 years. That may build over time to draw symptoms of PTSD. In other instances, it could be one traumatic event. In Connecticut, I worked with a number of state police representatives and their union representatives to design the program, and 3 of them, I think there are 9, the law, but 3 of them were Newtown responders. One of them was there at the scene. The other 2 arrived a little later, but certainly witnessed all of it. And you think of traumatic events with the murder of 20 some odd children in an elementary school is dramatic. So the reason I mention that, because we all know about traumatic events, but the reason I mention that, oftentimes the first responders provide you with a very good understanding of the impact, the direct impact of these traumatic events to one's health. But it isn't just first responders. As you can see, many adults have experienced some type of traumatic event, and in some ways and 20% of those people go on to develop PTSD. So that's outside of the first responder realm. The first responders just are just exposed to more of it, right? And again, that draws the question specific to first responders, but PTSD is an issue that impacts a lot of different people. In my travels, I've had conversations with folks in different states who work with me to develop these programs in these other states, and it's always interesting. I always have a conversation at some point. Someone will draw their experiences to me with just a discussion about a parent or a sibling or maybe themselves who have been exposed to a traumatic event and developed the symptoms of PTSD. And you hear more of that in the media too, about the effects of exposure to a traumatic event. But so as we look at these different statistics, this is again to give you a good broad brush of, if we're looking at this nationally, what does this actually, how big is this? Which is really the question that a lot of folks have before any action is taken. Folks want to know how big it is, right? And I think for everyone on this call, very likely has been exposed either directly themselves or by a loved one or family member or friend or acquaintance who has been affected by PTSD. You can see this cost. And then finally, this last point I had mentioned about the VA, if you see those percentages of folks who have participated in different campaigns, it's almost as though, think of it almost as though it is it's the issue continues to percolate, continues to grow, but it just grows over time. It continues to get larger and larger. It doesn't get smaller. It doesn't diminish. It only draws more and more to it. So folks exposed, say, in the 90s to combat may have returned to work as a police officer, firefighter, and they have 30 years in, right? And I have had these conversations, and just a traumatic event could trigger all of that injury, right? That brain injury from combat in a mere split second. And I've had discussions with some first responders who have recovered from PTSD, who describe it as just like an overwhelming rush of emotion in an uncontrollable way. And I'm not going to speak to symptomology or anything like that. That's not my profession. But I will tell you that it is a type of condition that draws a sense of helplessness, really is how it's described, that there's just nothing they're very strong people. First responders are strong individuals. They're trained to be strong, resilient, but they're human beings. No one over time can continue to sort of think of it, it's not really self-medicating, but just sort of manage their own symptoms as they continue to grow, because they truly, in many instances, they just don't go away. They just get worse and worse. So as we talk about the preventative piece, a big item there is the training of colleagues to identify PTSD symptoms in their friends, in their colleagues, in their workmates, so that not only is the workmate encouraged to seek help, seek therapy, but their colleagues, their peers, create a safety net for them. And we'll talk about the success of peer programs here in a second. But I wanted to mention it, and again, the VA is important here because of some of the work that they're doing, and maybe even some of the success that they found in treatment. But to give you a sense as to how big is this issue, right? And I think that these two slides really capture it. So let's move into sort of an understanding of the terrain. I call this my terrain discussion. And this is true in any state. There is no state that has figured any of this stuff out. But I wanted to talk briefly about what I describe as variations and inconsistencies at the local level. And think of, and I promise I'm not bringing you back to grade school, but think of a graph with an X and Y axis, right? And so programs, resource programs, right, vary based on three different elements. Here's the first one, is geography. So larger cities and counties likely have broader, deeper, more expensive resources. Stands to reason, right? So the city of Atlanta has access to a lot of resources that a small town in southwest Georgia would not have access to, right? And again, and that's true with counties as well, but I don't mean to state the obvious, but what's important is if our goal here is to begin a dialogue or discourse around the creation of a consistent program within the state that draws on best practices, then we have to make better sense of how we can do that with these geographical and frankly, resource capital issues. In other words, small cities may not have the means to reach out and buy a very expensive employee assistance program, but they do have the means to create training programs that they can do themselves at the local level, and we'll talk about that in a second. So, smaller cities and counties likely offer some type of employee assistance program, but oftentimes those resources have a very low rate of utilization. EAP programs are, this call is not to belittle an EAP program, but the real challenge is not so much setting up the program, it's getting people to call the program, right? Because it's a program that doesn't necessarily reach out to a first responder as much as it waits for a first responder to call. And in some instances, and probably more often than not, the resources available, so think of a first responder calling an employee assistance program to describe symptoms or conditions or concerns that this first responder may have, that counselor in the EAP program, however licensed, and they tend to be master's level counselors, right? So they are trained, but they may not be trained in the treatment of trauma. They may be trained in other things, like, for example, alcoholism or tobacco cessation or any of those other items, but they may not have a specific designation or training in trauma. You hope that they do, and many do, but in some instances, when you're a small county and you're looking to just purchase an off-the-rack employee assistance program, many times you'll have counselors that frankly just don't have the real experience to treat it. There's a great example in Oregon. In that state, where Oregon is a progressive state in a lot of different ways, but in particular, they just developed, and I think it's about 6 months or so ago, they developed an employee assistance program and I'm pretty certain it's available throughout the state, but it's staffed with trauma treatment or counseling experienced counselors, right? So those are anyone who calls that EAP program, and again, I believe it's available across the state. Anyone who calls that EAP program will speak to specifically, and it's only for trauma, for behavioral health issues, will speak to someone who is well-versed in the treatment, right, and the counseling for folks with those conditions. Great idea. The reason I mention it is a very interesting step forward as states begin to figure out and even at the local level. Those are cities and counties in Oregon, not the state of Oregon, but cities and counties who are joining together, just as we are in this call, to determine what steps they can take as a group to create a consistent program. So creating an employee assistance program with counselors, experienced counselors, is the good first step to creating a consistent program. Okay, that's our geography. Makes sense, right? First responder differences. If you speak to law enforcement, you speak to the fire service and EMTs, these aren't broad differences, but there are, I would say, these are preferences. And I wanted to make this point clear is that the creation of a consistent risk management program, right, a type of support program, really requires a partnership, and they don't always partner, a partnership between law enforcement and fire. So they have to be, whether it's a small town or a big county, both of those entities need to draw together to be part of a partnership to determine what and how that program will roll out. Remember, we're searching for consistency here. So the program should be consistent because PTSD doesn't know that you're a police. It doesn't or care that you're a firefighter. It doesn't even care if you're on this side of the state line or if you're in Alabama. It is PTSD. So it stands to reason that the program will be consistent provided you have the partnership of the different stakeholders in the creation of those programs, right? Those risk management programs. And I mentioned, because peer support programs tend to be very held very highly, regardless of police, fire, EMT. They and it doesn't surprise me, and it shouldn't surprise anyone on this call, that peer support programs, in other words, in their group, their colleagues are directly or a part of the program. Everyone is a stakeholder in the program. So peer support means that you are tied, if you are suffering from PTSD or from behavioral health, you are tied directly to a support program of your colleagues. Why is that important? One, it's a program, which is important, right, in and of itself. But two more points. One is it helps reduce whatever stigma there might be in a reluctance to seek help, right, which has always been the biggest issue with the first responders and PTSD is that, and it's a lingering issue, but it's getting better. There was always this concern about, and I mentioned this earlier, always this concern about some sort of confession that you're in fact struggling with, this type of disorder. And I think in so many ways, you think of a program, this notion of stakeholders of the program, right, your colleagues, draws in, here's the second point, a much higher sense of confidence in not only in approaching your peers for assistance and guidance, so you have confidence that they will support you, but then two, and this is an issue with health, regardless of whether it's PTSD or others, there's confidentiality. In other words, first responders should feel confident enough to approach a peer to discuss this condition. And I recognize when I say that, that's easier said than done. I know that. I absolutely know that. But that's really what we're talking about is the beginning of the creation. And again, everyone is in a slightly different place. Some cities, some counties have all of this figured out, and they're doing a fantastic job. I received an email regarding a county in Georgia that is utilizing a type of employee assistance program staffed with trauma-experienced counselors. So it's great to see that. That's one county, and forgive me, I forget the name of the county, but that is, so we're already seeing good steps forward in direction that way. So, okay, and then occupations outside of police and fire. I mentioned EMTs, and so I'll put the three of them in the primary class. Because I think in some ways that tends to be the first step in the discussion. I mentioned this earlier, is 911 or 911 operators, correctional folks, parole officers, a lot of folks that don't quite fit law enforcement or police. They may be inspectors, but in so many ways, they've all been, very likely in their careers, they've all been exposed to trauma. So I mention that only because, and this is an issue that speaks in many ways to the types of legislation around PTSD, that it isn't just the creation of a program for just two designated classes. It really is about a program that's flexible enough to begin to embrace other occupations that are exposed to trauma as well. I do think, in terms from a risk management perspective, right, is that we have to be careful not to expand it to every employee. And again, every municipal employee has some type of health insurance that would support them. But I do believe, and this is the reason that I made the point, is that likely in discussions you'll see different representatives of occupations beyond police, fire, EMT approach you with a suggestion that potentially they should be part of these same programs or should be designated as a stakeholder to those programs. And that may be very easy to accommodate, but it's something to keep your eye on. If you look at one of the best examples of programs is, of all places, Canada. And virtually, I think every province in Canada has some type of PTSD program and legislation in place. Two of them, Ontario is one of them, actually provides PTSD support for any occupation, for any person in the general population suffering from PTSD. Now, socialized medicine has a lot to probably do with the explanation of that, but it's a great example of a trend that is moving unexpectedly in a much broader fashion than one would imagine. The only reason I mention it. Okay, so resource variations and inconsistencies at the local level is just that is, in many ways, this slide is our signpost. In other words, as we begin to look at potential structure, we want to know because we'll need to address issues in the construction of a program. So we want to make sure we understand that geography will be different, which will cause differences in the program. We want to know that based on first responders, there'll be some different interpretations or evaluations or estimations as to what these services should be. We just need to know that, because to create a preventative plan is to embrace all of this, right? This is all of our concern, and then determine what's the best course. Knowing that everything these days, if you're local government, at the local level, you know that the federal government is not helping here, and I mean, in rare instances, obviously. The state governments, to the extent they can, but there's very little help there. And that's a point I make in the conferences that I speak at. So in some ways, this truly is our issue at the local level, at the municipal and at the county level. This is an issue. It's a national issue, but it's our issue. So we've got to make sure we understand these moving parts as we begin to create a program. Okay, we are now going to shift into the best practices discussion part of it. And I'm going to take a little extra time on some of these slides just to round them out. Here's the first piece we need to better understand. And this is really our first task. We think about if we're a city or a county struggling with the treatment or support for first responders with PTSD, or even municipal employees with PTSD. We've got to understand that in order to create a program, right? And I'm not suggesting going out and buying a $400,000 EAP program. That's not the intent of this discussion. This discussion is as stakeholders, as we come together, how can we create a program, our own preventative program? So as we look at it, we've talked about some of these too, but you think about the workplace culture as it stands today, very likely has or demonstrates in some fashion, whether you're a small fire department or a large police department, it's very likely that these conditions, right, are really a part of the obstacles that really confront a first responder who is suffering some of these symptoms. And stigma we've talked about. It's just a general fear of just saying the wrong things in difficult settings, and especially the loss of occupation. So let's take a moment there. So in a couple of states, there's been a lot of, I've had in conversations, a lot of grappling, especially with law enforcement, where once it's determined that a police officer is either diagnosed with PTSD or a behavioral health condition, they may in fact, and this is likely the case, is that they will lose their weapon, right? Which for them is in so many ways represents the fantastic, the heroic work they've done through the years. So for a police officer to state squarely that he or she is suffering from these symptoms is really very difficult. It's a very difficult setting, and there's always a fear that they are simply going to be fired if they they almost like confession, but they're fired if they seek help or seek some type of support, whether it's peer support or others. So confidentiality is enormous here, right? And I can't stress it enough, is that when we start getting into the structure of some of these programs and some good best practices, is to understand that this idea of preserving confidentiality has to be a primary principle in discussion and in the creation of the program. And in some ways, if you think of a statement that is the goal of the program, right? Some sort of, I know that sounds like corporate speak, but some statement that captures not only the reasons and the intention of drawing together to create a program, but also this pressing issue of preserving confidentiality. And as you know, that's woven into any health issues. It's woven into hundreds of different HR issues, all of those things. So it stands to reason that with a program designed to respond to PTSD symptoms in a first responder, confidentiality has to be reinforced. And I am not suggesting that we write it down on paper and walk away from it, but we make clear in our discussions, because we're all stakeholders here, remember, that confidentiality is truly the centerpiece here, so that a first responder is comfortable approaching a peer or a colleague with concerns about his or her mental health. And again, I essentially just said this, but let me just reiterate it. It's only the shift in culture that lessens or remove those three barriers that are stated above. Again, we address as a group. It isn't simply senior management telling us that we need to shift our culture. We need to do those things. And just like you, in those meetings where someone in senior management comes in and tells me exactly what I'm supposed to do, oftentimes I always listen, but I always try to remember, is that something that is what is the intent of that message? And probably more important, the senior management, or is senior management vested in the success of that program, right? That is a central part we'll talk about here as it comes up. But it's also the reason why everybody must be committed to a change. And what are the consequences of change like this? Some of them are predictable, but productivity, attendance, worker engagement, a reduction in absenteeism, performance, morale issues. But I just think it's the sort of, and I have seen this, and I saw this in Connecticut last week when the governor signed the law, and I've seen it a few times too, a few other times, where the emotion that you see that's shared between police and fire, and these are senior. There are senior police officers from other states attending the signing of this legislation, and there were senior firefighters, fire chiefs from other states, as well as the head of the fire union nationally was at the signing of this. And I mean, I was and correctly stood in the background behind a police officer who was about 4 times my size. And I watched that police officer embrace his colleague on the fire service, who was his friend, and I sort of eavesdropped a little bit, but the emotion in their voices when that bill was signed was absolutely inspiring, absolutely inspiring. So workplace culture, that's what, as we bear in mind these resource variations, so we understand that, but we also understand that, and I can tell you right now, regardless of the condition, I'm going to presume that every workplace, right, every first responder workplace in the state of Georgia has a culture that can improve. Everyone can be better. And that's, in some ways, as you think about risk management and loss control, everyone can be better at it. And everyone can be better at understanding PTSD. And everyone holds the responsibility to be certain that they are attuned to, they are a part of, and they are subject matter experts like nobody's business on these programs. Okay. All right, so let's move into what I wanted to do is to provide you with what I call a 3-2 strategy, or to give you a little bit of the structure, right? We don't have enough time today to dig every one of these pieces out with detail. These literally could be 100 slides if we had the time. Excuse me. But what I wanted to do is to give you a sense as to, now we're looking at the structure of a program at the local level. And I'm not talking about a state program where the state says, okay, everybody has to do these things. What I'm talking about is the stakeholders in a large county, stakeholders in a small city, any combination can apply these best practices in some fashion, right? This isn't about purchasing a technology to accomplish goals for us. This is about folks gathering together, committing to a goal, and then beginning to rough out the structure. So what I wanted to do is expose you to what I call a 3-2 strategy, and I use this in my speaking and at some conferences, but it's to really give you a sense as to almost like think of it, the framing of a home, right? And so you drive by, you can see where the living room would be, you see the bedrooms, you see the hallways, where the doors will go, but there's no walls, right? You don't have any of that built. So what I wanted to show you is just what the framing looks like, okay? And it has 5 parts to it. There were 3 primary parts, and then the 2 parts behind it are, I wouldn't necessarily say not primary, but think of these first 3 are the 3 you really have to develop or you have to build, right? So you're the carpenter, the lumber arrives, the foundation is set because we just walked through that, because if you think of it, in our analogy, the foundation really is the shift in culture. So we've shored up the walls, or the foundation walls, with concrete and rebar and all the stuff that goes into foundations, to be certain that we're starting from a strong foundation or starting point, right? In other words, we've established everything that we need to before we begin to build the framework. So again, we have our hammers, the lumber arrives, this is our blueprint. So the first part is a strategy and program development. I know this sounds slightly general, but it really isn't. This is where we capture what it is that we're going to do. And we have to sit together to talk about this, right? As a team, together with representatives from all the stakeholders, sit together and walk through this. The good news is the first responders are exposed to and have experienced with support programs, but they probably haven't seen everything. And everyone will have a different impression of the importance of certain things. This should be more important than that, or we agree that this is important than that. So in these first steps, especially in the first step, this takes time, and dedication to be certain that you have created the basic principles or tenets of the program. But it isn't just, again, back to this pointing at senior management, it isn't senior management telling anyone what the program is. It's the group, stakeholders, developing strategies and programs, drawing from input from everyone to ensure that the fit is proper to the municipality or to the county. And it must reflect that same positive culture that is dedicated to supporting colleagues with defined roles and responsibilities. In other words, if you think about whether everyone here has a responsibility, so senior management has a responsibility, middle management has a responsibility, line fire and police have a responsibility. Everyone has a responsibility, not only to create the program, but to participate in it and support it, right? And supporting colleagues too. This is the heavy lifting, but if we get this right, many of the other parts of the framing of the house become easier, and you'll see that as we go through it. And again, in that discussion, stakeholders would review, resources that are potentially available, and some of the things that they could build themselves. So an EAP program likely is going to come from a source. Peer support can be built within the first responder ranks, and then critical incident stress debriefing is very common after, and many have access to that type of debriefing. And in some ways, if a smaller city doesn't have access to it, it's likely that they potentially would go to a larger city to request some assistance, or a county or some things like that. I've seen in other states where especially in rural, this is in rural New York, where the small towns don't have a lot of resources, so they work with the county to develop resources at a local level. So in the event that something traumatic happens, they are, think of it as sort of sharing that critical incident stress. It's unique though, because it's the cities and the counties coming together. So think of it as one county, maybe 20 cities that work together to create these sorts of programs. And I've seen in a couple of instances and I've worked in a program there, but there was a incident, you may recall, when the limousine crashed and everyone died in the results of the accident. There was something like 200 first responders that participated in that recovery or that catastrophe, and they were describing a day after the incident, the police and fire jointly issued an invitation to everyone who was, and frankly anybody who wanted to attend, at the local high school. And this is in a very small town in upstate New York. They don't have a critical incident stress debriefing. They don't have an EAP. I think they barely had a peer support. So they really didn't have a lot. They weren't prepared for this sort of catastrophe, really. And so they invited the first responders to the local high school in the basketball auditorium to sit and talk as a group. And they expected, I don't know, for any number of reasons, they didn't expect a lot of folks to even show. As it turned out, more than 200 first responders, including two of my friends who were at that scene, went to the high school, and the police and fire partnership designed to support those folks realized that this issue, the stress debriefing, was so important that they needed to go to another county outside of wherever they were to access a program. And the county very gratefully and willingly provided access to the resources that they had, which included an EAP program, and they had their own stress debriefing that was, I think, built on a state police model. But it just gives you the reason I mention that is it strikes me when I think about that we're, you don't expect 200 first responders to participate in a meeting about managing stress. It does indicate that, I think, in some ways, or demonstrate how the stigma around that is slowly diminishing. Anyway, so next part is communication. Really, is a big piece of this. Right, everyone needs to know what it is that they need to know. The workplace campaigns are important. So clear and effective communication of the programs and resources. I would say this, but I would also say, I mean, maybe even more important is that is continual communication of available programs. So it is not a poster at the fire department. It is not just maybe a once a year briefing. You would want folks really having frequent exposure to the resources or to the program or where they can go. So people are getting emails periodically once a month that say, you know, you're struggling, here's your confidential telephone number, toll-free number, call this number to speak to someone or reach out to your peer, right? So think of it as reinforcing, right? Behavioral reinforcing is one thing. This is sort of reinforcing through communication. You just want everyone aware of it, and you want everyone to be a champion of it too. I haven't mentioned that before, but really it is a big piece of it is every first responder needs to be a champion of their program. They need to be able to stand in a group of their peers and make very clear that this program is designed to support them specifically. With that, and that's not an endorsement. That is a commitment to it. So, and then finally, training is a big piece here too. And again, training can be done without the purchase of technology, those sorts of things. There's a lot of stuff online too that is available that would assist in the training. But when I think of training, and training is in a lot of materials that you read in different states that are trying to implement these consistent programs, training is a big centerpiece of it. So they talk about a couple of things. One is, there's always an interview prior to joining the service where maybe questions are asked, and a lot of this needs to be confidential, obviously, but there's a discussion there. But also at that point, when a first responder joins the ranks, that they receive training early in the process, and that is training around the condition, that is training around a recognition of their symptoms, that is training around recognizing colleagues' symptoms, and that is training around their role and their responsibility as a stakeholder. So I say that's initial training. One of the things that I've seen is in a lot of instances, a first responder will receive training and then some period of time goes by, and it may be a long period of time, and they'll get a little more training. I think that a goal, one of our goals here should be that we have only consistent training, but we have training that is scheduled, that is mandatory, and that is effective, right? So it isn't just a mention at the fire department that here's some things to think about when it comes to PTSD. It's literally training and invite. There's a lot of subject matter experts that would gladly speak to groups on this, right? Whether it's local physicians, someone who's trained in trauma I'm certain you should reach out to them to determine whether they could speak and help with the training as well. But it is something that can be created at a local level. And again, resources online, no doubt, right? And there's a lot of it. So go online and look to determine those additional resources. But I think the biggest issue around training, which is a big keystone to the success of a program, is that it is ongoing training, right? It's ongoing. People are continually trained on it, and it is frequently ongoing. But I think that as you think of the first three parts, is just to go through it one more time. One is the formal development of a program. So you have to take time, you have to write it down, you have to commit to it, right? And you have to communicate, and you have to draw everyone in and communicate the programs, and then everyone needs to be trained on it, right? And I would also suggest as part of training too, and again, this is a resource question, but in many ways, every first responder I can't tell people what to do, but a good suggestion would be, and I've seen this in other instances where first responders have individual discussions with managers or folks who participate or peers regarding their condition every year. So there's an expectation that once a year, a first responder has the opportunity to sit with a peer and discuss, their general I wouldn't say mental health, but how they're doing, what they've seen, how and then there's anything that the colleague, that the peer can assist with. I see that I've seen that in other states. That's pretty common. So forgive me, it's very likely that you may already be doing that, but it's very important I think of these first three strategies. This is true with all of it. And these first three strategies, risk management strategies, is to write it down. I know it sounds like I'm speaking to my kids. Write it down and commit to it. That's the biggest piece, right? And that's the biggest step forward. But once you're there, then a lot of it will come together. Okay, last two pieces. These are a little different. These tend to be, some of these may have, especially the mental health providers, geography may play a role here to some extent. But so as you think of it, I think these next two strategies tend to be specifically addressed or important or relevant when the first responder is actually suffering from symptoms or potentially even diagnosed. And the first three, if we go back to our original goal here, is to examine or discuss preventative principles. The first three really are prevention, right? How do we keep our colleagues, our peers, our friends, family members in good mental health? Those first three support that, whereas these next two really speak to the need to draw in resources. So mental health providers, and this is something that I've been working on for a while, you really need to identify mental health counselors who are experienced in treating trauma. And I know they're saying that sounds like that's just an easy thing. You just get out the phone book and they're right there. You have to do a little bit of legwork to do this, but you have to remember a couple things. One is, when I mentioned that, I don't mention that I'm not talking about psychiatrists or psychologists. That's a whole other issue, and that's really around the diagnosis part of it. But in terms of treatment, there are counselors available in a couple of different ways. One is they certainly could be local counselors, but very likely it would be the first responder would have access to counselors either telephonically or think of it like Skype. So I mentioned the VA a couple of times. Let me just get through this point. I know we're running over our hour here, but so the VA, to manage the volume of PTSD claims nationally that continues to grow, they have a very large bet in telemedicine or telepsychiatry. In other words, if you are 100 miles from the local VA hospital, and you're suffering from PTSD, I don't know how likely it is you're going to get in a car and drive, but you can access counseling and therapy through telemedicine, right? And this is a growing segment. I encourage you to again, do research on telemedicine and how this might work, but many of the mental health counselors very likely would work. They certainly will work telephonically, but may also work in some sense via Skype, something like that. And there are some therapies that even require Skyping. But I think what's most important here is to identify them. Take the time, determine how many. If you're a small county, you don't need a lot. You may only need a few folks who are dedicated to it. There's probably some costs associated with that, but at least you would have this formal or informal network of counselors who would provide counseling to the first responders. One of the biggest issues around resources and counseling is that the first responders don't know where to go. EAP programs are a little bit of an assistance there because they know that 800 number is mentioned, so they can call the EAP program. That's helpful as well. But you might consider creating and this is, I mean, I say this doesn't exist in a lot of different places, but I think you are going to see this in a lot of places, is to create some sort of formal or informal network of counselors available by, 800 number for first responders. And I've mentioned telemedicine, which may help in rural areas, but especially in those parts of Georgia where potentially the counties and cities or a county and some cities are joining together to create a program together, that formal or informal network just might work. So I think I recognize that it's different and different wherever you are. I just want to make sure I got that out to you. And then finally, intervention and treatment. And I've mentioned this a couple of times. Stakeholders really need to be trained to identify symptoms in themselves and others. The peer support program should be structured to provide quick and effective engagement where they see it. So you have real stakeholders of the program and who can do that or provide that service. Again, that your network, if established, could assist and support in the intervention. And then finally, if a colleague is at risk to harming himself and others, and this is the work that you do, you just need you design an action plan to engage with immediate treatment. Know what it is that you'll do. And I guess you already have something similar to that. I just mention it because it's important, and oftentimes, when a first responder, when a colleague is at risk, a lot of people don't know about it, right? There's someone who's suffering in their own silence and not really sharing it with anyone. So the 3-2 strategy is, we'll go through it just one more time. So you think of the first 3 parts as we're framing our preventative program, right? Is the actual development of the program. The second piece is a communication strategy that supports it, that's ongoing. So people are always aware of it. And then training, which provides every stakeholder, senior management to line officer, with the training that they need to understand the issue and understand not only resilience or resiliency training to understand how they manage those symptoms, but where to go in the event that they have real concern. Those are the 3 primary. And then the last 2 is consideration of the creation of a network for mental health providers. And then finally, intervention and treatment, which is, again, I mentioned that it's very likely you have some program of some sort already in place for that. So my effort here today was to provide you with a sense of an understanding from a sense of risk management, what steps may be taken to develop a consistent program, right, in light of geography differences and first responder services differences, that supports a positive workplace culture, but gives you the blueprint to build your program. And again, let me mention this last piece. So everyone nationally is concerned on this issue, and everyone nationally at the local level recognizes that it is their responsibility to as a stakeholder to create the solution, the support for their community. It's that issue. It's a local issue. It's our issue. The good news is, if I don't have to rely on the federal government, which I don't, or the state government, which on question there, I always rely on my own community to be a part of that solution. And as I said before, in so many ways, we're all stakeholders of this issue, but we're all stakeholders of its solution. So with that said, Dan, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much. Great job, John. We really appreciate your expertise. Does anyone have any questions? Well, with that, John, again, you did a fantastic job. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you so very much. We'll be sending out this recording and the presentation to all those that registered. If you have any questions in the interim, or after, please email those to me. And if we can answer them, we'll get that back to you. So thank you so much. Thank you again, John. Everyone have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.